People are saying that Noam Chomsky has effectively ruined his legacy, and this only makes sense if you believe that he was supposed to be some kind of a saint. So, what am I getting at here? This is a multi-layered issue, so let's get at this. First and foremost, what needs to be acknowledged is that Noam Chomsky absolutely propped himself up as some sort of moral savior, some sort of messianic figure. There can be no doubt about that. The image that he often tried to sell to the public at large was that of this sort of stoic, detached philosopher living on the fringes of society who cares not for money or status or even food to a certain degree. Much like, or rather akin to, the Alan Moore character in the comic book The Watchmen. That is Rorschach. The brooding, possible white supremacist, although he doesn't quite get into that, but, there's a sort of implication there of strong, at least right-wing tendencies. That, Rorschach is this righteous man, and spoiler alert, if you haven't read the comic, let alone seen the Zack Snyder film, then you would know that he ultimately dies. And why does he die? Rorschach needs to die in order for the new world to come about that Ozymandias was seeking to create. Again, I said spoilers, so I warned you, but why am I bringing up a 1980s comic book? Well, quite precisely because that is the kind of individual that Noam Chomsky essentially portrayed himself as to the public. He portrayed himself as the brooding philosopher, not a philosopher king, but a philosopher peasant, who was sort of, or philosopher thug, if you will, who was sort of excluded on the outside. Only he, with his keen analytic eye, can see through the lies of the Matrix and so on and so forth. That was the image that he spent more or less the last 50 years cultivating and impregnating, essentially, into the minds of many young fans. I never bought it. Not once. I never drank the Kool-Aid, and I'm going to tell you why. Because it always struck me that someone who was so detached and so sort of stoic and, sort of the night, that sort of Bane quote from the movie, what was it? I was born in darkness, that quote from Bane. And he says, the shadows betray you because they belong to me. Okay, so that is the sort of quote, and that's sort of the figure that he made himself out to be. I never bought it, and I'll tell you why I never bought it. Because if you are this sort of detached thug philosopher, if you will, then why the hell are you working at MIT, of all places? Think about it. The number one place to develop weapon systems and things like AI and so on and so forth, which Noam Chomsky's own work in linguistics had a deep impact upon. Why are you then working for this place and there for decades and decades and decades? Professor Emeritus, even, that was the status that he gained. And so this always sort of stuck out to me, and I'm not alone in thinking this. For example, the UK Communist Party pointed this out. They actually have a video on YouTube from years ago talking about this apparent contradiction in the image that Chomsky tried to cultivate for himself. And it's very interesting because when you get into this, what you realize, what you ought to realize, is essentially what was the number one message of the Bible. And I say this as a pagan, an idol-worshipping pagan occultist of the Polynesian, specifically Māori tradition in which I was raised. So I am not here to seek to, engage in mockery of the Judeo-Christian, it's the only time I'm going to use that term, Judeo-Christian, text, but rather to appreciate it and its message. And the number one message for those of you that have read the book, as you would know, seems to have not been absorbed. It's so bizarre that this book, that outside of Polynesian circles at least, and even within Polynesian circles, surprisingly, that has so much sway over people that they never sort of got the message of the book. And what was the number one message of the book? The number one message of the book is that prophets are but men. That is the sort of recurring theme. David, an adulterer, Adam, literally responsible for the fall of humanity, and, of course, King Solomon falling to paganism, which is pagan. I don't think is a bad idea, but we can get into that another time. The point is that these were all men who were flawed, and women as well, who were flawed, deeply, deeply flawed, sometimes straight up villains, but nonetheless champions on behalf of the starving masses. I mean, many of the things that they teach in the Bible is essentially broad economic justice and so on and so forth. Reminds me of the Simon and Garfunkel song, Hello Darkness, My Old Friend, in which it talks about how the words of the prophets are written on subway walls and tenement halls. How true that is, until you realize that said prophet has just come out of an insane asylum. And I think this needs to be taken into account deeply and truly digested and absorbed, because the reality is that people are going to disappoint you. People are humans. They're going to deeply disappoint you in ways that you can't imagine. Many on the left are reeling and are heartbroken, rightfully to a certain degree, I would say, because at the end of the day, Noam Chomsky did distribute the Kool-Aid. There's no doubt about that. But there also needs to be some self-reflection, because why did you drink the Kool-Aid in the first place? Why did you believe that a man who worked for many, many decades at perhaps one of the most prestigious research institutions in the entire world, a millionaire, essentially, this man, by no means poor, was somehow this detached, sort of stoic, Rorschach-like figure? It was a lie. It was always a lie. And it was obviously a lie. It was a self-refuting lie, so much so that an idiot such as myself was able to see through it. I don't consider myself to be no more smarter than the next man, and yet I was able to see behind the curtain, so to speak. And so that is the point that I want to get at, is that people are going to disappoint. Now we need to get real here, because when it comes to the Epstein files, I have sort of multiple sort of layered takes on this. So number one, it's obvious, like I said, that Chomsky cares about importance, he cares about flattery, and so on and so forth. And so he was more than willing to accept gifts and experiences and so on and so forth from Jeffrey Epstein. There's no doubt about that. That can't be denied. The important thing is that there is no criminal activity on his part, not once, not even an implication of it, unlike a certain man named Dershowitz, who had multiple accusations, but apparently that's been sorted out legally. I don't know, I can't comment, but the point is there's not even smoke here with regards to Noam Chomsky, which is important because I think that is able to calm down much of the sort of hysteria and reeling and rightful heartache people are feeling. But there's more to this. Let me get at this. Noam Chomsky has built a career on always being right. Think about it, always being right. Noam was never wrong. Now, that's important to understand, because in his life, that means he's the kind of person that doubles down, triple down even. And so the total lack of accountability on the part of Noam Chomsky when questioned about this and so on and so forth is not surprising. This man is never wrong by his own account. He's always right. And so when he is right, we cheer for him. When he's wrong, we don't. And that's the way it should be. The other part as well that I want to bring into this is that one of the things talked about is that Noam Chomsky is a very good friend. Now, I need to be careful in the way that I sort of word this, because going to come across perhaps as some kind of racist, and I don't want to be interpreted that way, but basically this is what I'm trying to say. I am Māori. Māori, we are a tribal people. There is deep bonds of tribal loyalty among our people. We mobilize, we look out for each other, and so on and so forth. That is how we operate as Māori. Jews are very similar. They're very sort of together. They operate, they sort of look out for one another. But not necessarily fellow Jews, just like my fellow Māori, but also just people within their circle. They tend to be quite defensive of. So, what am I getting at? Well, when you read the email exchanges between him and between Epstein and Chomsky, it's obvious that Chomsky believes him to be innocent. Now, did he really believe him in his heart of hearts? Probably not. You know what I mean? But this is a case of willful ignorance, I believe. And it's a common symptom among sort of, I guess you could say, tribal people who are living in the modern era, that sort of certain cultures where they are very tribal and very loyal to those around them and to friends, even people that are not necessarily Māori or Jewish or whatever, there can be a tendency to be loyal to a fault. And it's one thing, I don't like to call it tribalism, because true tribalism holds people accountable. But rather, I like to perhaps call it for the homies. Perhaps we could call this homieism. I don't know. Perhaps there could be a way to describe it. But basically, we see the example in Francis Ford Coppola, for example, where the director of Jeepers Creepers, a film that I really like, by the way, and was so disappointed when I found out about what the director had done. He counseled him and sort of helped him through prison. Why is that? Again, because of that bond. That sort of bond where you kind of do mental gymnastics and you say to yourself, well, yes, I wouldn't agree with this, and we're this a total stranger, and so on and so forth, and yes, absolutely. But because it's the homie, you say, well, this is an exception. Maybe the kid looked like an adult or whatever. There's a sort of, he had a breakdown, all of these sort of things. And it is quite evident that Noam Chomsky was coming at it from that perspective with regards to Jeffrey Epstein. In other words, this was a personal friend, and he was willfully ignorant with regards to the horrors that this man committed. And I have to admit something, and I don't like to say it, but yes, among certain cultures there is a danger towards being all about the homies. That's true, but it's also something that we tend to do, at least within those groups, Māori, my people, for example, as men. And so, while the red pill often likes to talk about, how women are sort of not loyal and all of this sort of stuff, which to a certain degree can be true in some cases, where you will find, for example, a mother who was willing to essentially use her own son as cannon fodder for the sisterhood. Deplorable, absolutely horrible behavior and mindset, blah, blah, blah. There's the other element here, which is that the other extreme is that there are cases where men, as evidenced by Noam Chomsky, are willing to be willfully ignorant or like I said, Francis Ford Coppola, where it's sort of, okay, I accept that you're guilty, but I'm willing to say that this was some sort of breakdown or whatever. In other words, there is a tendency within the masculine energy in its sort of distorted tribal context to be more charitable, more generous, more compassionate, if you will, towards those that really don't deserve it, and they are only getting it because they are the homie. I think a prime example of this would have to be the heinous, awful cover-ups within the Catholic Church of the crimes, which by no means reflects the majority of clergy. The vast majority of Catholic clergy, particularly today, are fine people. They're wonderful people. But in the past, there was a problem, and it was covered up. There can be no doubt about that. And we know why. because this is men looking out for men. And so perhaps we should do some introspection that on the one hand, the red pill may be right in pointing out certain things. Perhaps we as men need to also look inward and sort of ask ourselves, who are we willing to support and who are we willing to stand by and so on and so forth. And it's a difficult conversation to have. And what are the parameters and so on and so forth? I don't have an answer. And I don't think there is one. Universally speaking, that is. The other thing that I want to get into, now that I've fully debunked the hero archetype, is the ideas of Noam Chomsky. I consider Noam Chomsky to be an incredible intellectual influence, particularly upon myself, when it comes to not only my development as a leftist, but also my own sort of philosophical outlook on life and so on and so forth. The ideas of Noam Chomsky are still relevant today, even if the man himself has ruined his legacy. His critiques of power, his championing of libertarianism, actual libertarianism, his championing of anarchism, his philosophy of science, his critiques of Karl Popper, and so on and so forth. These are worth holding on to. These are wonderful treasures, gifts, if you will, that we ought to continue to embrace and take with us. For example, Albert Einstein, were he alive today, would be a victim of Me Too, a rightful victim of Me Too, I might add. But nonetheless, we still accept and celebrate his contributions. Now, whether or not they should be celebrated, they should absolutely be incorporated. And that is my view when it comes to Noam Chomsky, is that his insights, his ideas, are absolutely worth embracing, worth holding on to, even if the man himself ought to be discarded or not. That's a personal decision on your part. And so what I want to say is that, number one, I do have compassion for those that are hurt by this, because he did cultivate a sort of cult of personality, if you will, of being the outsider. But then at the same time, I'm going to be honest, you kind of should have been a bit more critical. I mean, if I could have seen through the facade, if you will, then it sort of strikes me that not many others did, and one of the critiques, perhaps the only valid critique or observation of him that has come from the right, is from Thomas Sowell. Ironically, his name should be pronounced, at least according to the laws of the English language, Soul, because it's S-O-W, but we can ignore that. He said that had Chomsky simply stuck to linguistics, he would have been known everywhere for linguistics. Where it is relevant, he would have been relevant. But in entering politics, he became world famous. And I think that was a brilliant observation on the part of a man that I in no way agree with, nor ever will, is that at the end of the day, leftist politics, international critique, and so on and so forth, gave Noam Chomsky a level of fame and infamy to a certain degree that he never, ever, ever would have had he simply stuck with linguistics and philosophy.